Let's describe now the pharynx. We said that the nasal cavity ends at the level of the, in here, the internal nares. That's the end that connects the nasal cavity with the nasopharynx. Now the pharynx is this tube. I'm gonna put it here so we can see that it is a tube. This is a passageway that serves to conduct, or in here it passes air and food at the same time. And this pharynx is divided into three sections. The section right posterior, the superior portion of the pharynx, that is posterior to the nasal cavity, right above or superior to the uvula, this is your nasopharynx, this section in here, nasopharynx. Now, in between or below, inferior to the uvula but superior to this cartilage, which is one of the laryngeal cartilages, the epiglottis, this portion, right, the posterior portion of your oral cavity, that will be what you see back there, that's your oral pharynx. And inferior to the epiglottis up to the inferior border of another cartilage that you can see here, this ring of cartilage, there is bigger or thicker than this one. Right up to there, into the inferior border, that's the laryngopharynx. Okay, so three sections: nasopharynx, oropharynx, laryngopharynx. Three boundaries important to remember. That's the uvula, the epiglottis, and the inferior border of the cricoid cartilage of the larynx. Now, the nasopharynx. Let's describe the nasopharynx. The nasopharynx, as I told you, its inferior border is the uvula. Where is the uvula? Let me show you here. This, and I'm sorry, this is kind of blurry. Hard to find sometimes good pictures. But this thing hanging on the back of your throat, this is the uvula. Okay, mucosal tissue there is hanging in there, and this opening, we'll describe later this opening. Let's focus on the uvula. So the uvula is the inferior border or inferior boundary of the nasopharynx. What is the function of this? When we are swallowing, this flap moves superiorly. So now it gets oriented in this position, closing the passageway of food that we're swallowing here through the oral cavity, preventing this passage of food from the oral cavity into the nasopharynx. Now, two important structures that we're going to find in the nasopharynx. One is this piece of lymphoid tissue that is part of our immune system, that where the actual fight between invaders that are trying to get into our body through the nasal cavity are destroyed. Here is where the battle happens. And this tonsil, and we're going to describe several of them, this tonsil is called the pharyngeal tonsil because it's located in the pharynx, and it's also called your adenoid. Your adenoid. Sometimes it gets inflamed most of the time in reaction to an allergen, in allergic reactions, and we will see what happens when this adenoid gets inflamed because of allergic reaction or because of an infection. Another important structure, the second structure that we're going to describe here in the nasopharynx, is the auditory tube. This is the auditory tube, and is also called the pharyngo, well, that's a Y, tympanic. Gosh, it's so hard to write with this. Okay, the pharyngeal tympanic tube. It's called like that also because this tube connects your pharynx, your nasopharynx, with your middle ear, right here. And this tube is important. Let me show it to you in here. See, it's this tube in here. This is your ear, external ear, middle ear, inner ear. Here in the middle ear, you have air. And in here, we have the tube opened into the nasopharynx. This tube, one of the functions is to equalize, okay, to make the same the pressure, the atmospheric pressure, and the pressure present right here in where is my here in the middle ear. That's one of the functions. Now, this tube in infants, you can see, is shorter, is more horizontal, and is wider than the one of the adult. As the kid grows into an adult size phase, this tube elongates. Now it gets posterior from horizontal to more on a diagonal, and it becomes thinner. These facts explain the ear infections following a throat infection or an infection in your pharynx are more common in infants than in grown-ups, in adults. An infection into your throat that can lead to the germs or bacteria or viruses, mostly viruses. Sometimes bacteria can crawl up from your pharynx through the auditory or pharyngeal tympanic tube into the middle ear and cause an ear infection or medial otitis. Since this tube in the grown-up is more, is more in a vertical, it's harder to get there, is thinner and longer. Infections of or otitis, ear infections after pharyngeal infection, a pharyngitis or throat infection, is less common in a grown-up. Okay, so those are the two structures that we need to describe in the nasopharynx: the adenoid or pharyngeal tonsil and the auditory tube. What happens if the adenoid gets inflamed and bigger? What do you think is going to happen? It can block this auditory tube. This is what we're going to discuss in class. Now, the next section of the pharynx, remember, is the oral, because it's behind the oral cavity. So this is the oropharynx, in between the soft palate and the epiglottis. Now, in here, we're going to find two more tonsils. And as you can see, the tonsils are strategically located around the openings of our body, just to, places where the immune battle, okay, the battle or the fight between invaders and our white cells, blood cells, takes place. So this, let me show you, the beginning of this, the oropharynx of this section is this opening in here that we call fauces. The fauces. Okay, so, and this is the superior boundary. The entrance is the fauces, and the superior boundary is the uvula. On either side, okay, about here, she doesn't have it too big, is where we're going to find the palatine tonsils. And on the base of the tongue, keep going backwards, on the base of the tongue, we can follow, this is your tongue, right? And right at the base is where we're going to find the lingual, because it's located in the tongue, in the base of the tongue, so it's called the lingual tonsil. The next portion then, it's the Laryngopharynx that begins, remember, at the level of the epiglottis and ends at the inferior border of the cricoid cartilage. So in here it's easy to identify the cricoid cartilage. In here you just need to see that is the bigger ring. So that's the boundary. And as you can see, again, this is a tube that is shared by the respiratory system. This is your airway, but also by the digestive system. This pharynx leads to the larynx anteriorly and the esophagus posteriorly. So as you can see, all the sections of the pharynx are conducting air and food, except of course the nasopharynx. The nasopharynx is only conducting air, hopefully. But the oropharynx and the laryngopharynx are conducting air, but food as well. So we need, certain mechanisms to make sure that the food follows the digestive tract and the air follows the respiratory tract. One of those mechanisms was the uvula that blocks the entrance or the passage of food into the nasal cavity. The other mechanism is the epiglottis, which is a cartilage of the larynx, and it acts pretty much like the uvula. When we swallow this flap, this cartilage moves in this direction, closing now the passage to the respiratory tract. It closes the larynx, so the food can go or move along towards the esophagus. What else? I think that's it. Okay, so in the next section, let's describe, and I knew I wanted to show you something else. In here, this guy, this is an anatomic model, and he's like pretending to introduce a laryngoscope. You introduce that, a tube with a camera and a flashlight at the end, and you introduce that instrument through the nose. You pass in through the inferior nasal meatus, get to the nasopharynx above or superior to the uvula or soft palate, and as you can see, you can or what it gets illuminated in here is this portion, which is the oropharynx, and this portion there is the laryngopharynx. So in here you can see again the communication, or that the laryngopharynx opens into both the larynx and the esophagus. So in the next video we're going to describe the larynx, next section of the respiratory tract. See you then.